Right now, as you watch this video, France is teetering on the edge of an economic abyss that could swallow not just the French Republic, but drag the entire European Union down with it. This isn't speculation. This isn't fear-mongering. This is happening right now, and the consequences will reshape Europe as we know it. Drop a comment below with your country's flag and tell us if you think your nation will survive what's coming. And yeah, smash that subscribe button because what I'm about to reveal will shock you to your core. France, the land of revolution, enlightenment, and European power, is crumbling from within. The streets of Paris are no longer just the romantic boulevards we see in postcards. They're battlegrounds where pension reform protests have turned violent, where immigrant communities clash with police weekly, and where the fabric of French society is being torn apart at the seams. The French economy, once the beating heart of continental Europe, is now a patient on life support, and the doctors have run out of solutions. Let me paint you a picture of what's really happening behind the carefully curated news reports. France's public debt has exploded to over 112% of GDP, surpassing even the critical threshold that economists warned would trigger a cascade of failures. That's not just a number on a spreadsheet. That's over 3 trillion euros of debt that future generations of French citizens will be shackled to, assuming there's still a functioning France to inherit. The French government is borrowing money just to pay the interest on money they've already borrowed, a death spiral that has destroyed economies throughout history. The pension system, the sacred cow of French social policy, is mathematically impossible to sustain. French workers are retiring earlier than almost anywhere else in Europe, living longer than ever before, and there simply aren't enough young workers paying into the system to support the retirees. When President Macron attempted modest reforms to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, the entire country erupted in flames. Millions took to the streets, transportation ground to a halt, and the message was clear. The French population would rather watch their country burn than accept economic reality. But here's what makes this truly catastrophic for Europe. France isn't Greece, it isn't Portugal, it isn't some peripheral economy that the EU can bail out with a stern lecture and a loan package. France is the second largest economy in the European Union, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and a founding pillar of the European project itself. When France falls, it won't just create ripples, it will generate a tsunami that will crash over every European shore from Lisbon to Helsinki. The European Central Bank has already been playing a dangerous game, keeping interest rates artificially low for years to prevent countries like Italy and France from defaulting on their debts. But that strategy has reached its limits. Inflation has forced the ECB to raise rates, and now France is paying billions more in interest payments every single year. That's billions that can't be spent on infrastructure, education, healthcare, or any of the social programs that the French people have come to see as their birthright. The trap has been sprung, and there's no easy way out. Let's talk about the social collapse that's accelerating this economic disaster. France has some of the worst integrated immigrant communities in all of Europe. Suburbs around Paris, Lyon, and Marseille have become no-go zones where police fear to patrol and French law barely applies. These aren't racist talking points. These are facts acknowledged by French sociologists, politicians across the spectrum, and law enforcement officials themselves. The 2023 riots that followed the police shooting of a teenager in Nanterre saw entire neighborhoods burned, thousands of cars destroyed, and billions in property damage. The French education system, once the envy of the world, is now producing graduates who can barely compete on the global stage. French universities have plummeted in international rankings, scientific output is declining, and the best and brightest French minds are leaving for opportunities in the United States, United Kingdom, and even Asia. This brain drain is robbing France of the intellectual capital it needs to innovate its way out of crisis. When your doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs are fleeing to London and New York, you're not just losing workers, you're losing your future. The French labor market is a nightmare of regulations that make it nearly impossible to hire or fire workers. Companies face crushing payroll taxes that can reach 45% of salary costs, making French workers some of the most expensive in the developed world. Young people face unemployment rates above 20%, while protected older workers cling to positions they can never lose. This two-tier system creates a permanent underclass of youth who can't break into stable careers, fueling social resentment and political extremism on both the left and right. French productivity has stagnated while competitors race ahead. Germany, despite its own recent troubles, still maintains industrial prowess that France can't match. The United Kingdom, freed from EU regulations after Brexit, is attracting investment that once would have gone to Paris. Even Spain and Poland are becoming more competitive in key industries. France is being left behind, and the gap is widening every year. The famous French luxury brands, the aerospace industry, the nuclear power sector, these successes mask a broader economy that's rotting from within. Now let's examine how this French collapse will bankrupt Europe. The European Union is not just an economic zone, it's a complex web of mutual obligations, shared debt, and interconnected banking systems. When France sneezes, Germany catches pneumonia. French banks hold hundreds of billions in Italian debt. Italian banks hold Spanish debt. Spanish banks hold French debt. It's a house of cards, where the fall of one major pillar brings down the entire structure. The 2008 financial crisis will look like a minor correction compared to what's coming. The euro itself depends on the fiction that a German euro and a French euro and a Greek euro are all the same thing. But they're not, and the markets know it. When investors lose confidence in France's ability to repay its debts, they'll demand higher interest rates to lend to Paris. Those higher rates will make France's debt even more unsustainable, creating a vicious cycle that ends in default or monetization. If France is forced to print money to pay its debts, hyperinflation could ravage the Eurozone, destroying savings and pensions across the continent. Germany, the traditional economic engine of Europe, is in no position to rescue France this time. The German economy has been hammered by energy costs following the loss of cheap Russian gas, by competition from China in its critical automotive sector, and by its own demographic decline. German taxpayers have already spent hundreds of billions bailing out Greece, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal during the last crisis. They will not accept another massive bailout for France, especially when German workers retire later and receive smaller pensions than their French counterparts. The political consequences will be even more dramatic than the economic ones. Right-wing populist parties are already surging across Europe, feeding on anger over immigration, EU overreach, and economic inequality. When France collapses, these parties will gain unstoppable momentum. Marine Le Pen's National Rally is already the most popular party among French voters under 35. In Italy, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and Austria, parties once considered extreme are now mainstream or even in government. A French economic collapse will supercharge this trend, potentially ending the European Union as we know it. The migrant crisis, which Europe thought it had controlled, will explode again when France can no longer afford to maintain order or provide social services. Millions of migrants and refugees currently in France will move north and east, seeking better opportunities in more stable countries. This will trigger border closures, the collapse of the Schengen free movement zone, and possibly violence on a scale not seen in Europe since World War II. Countries will turn inward, nationalism will triumph over cooperation, and the dream of a united Europe will die in the streets of burning French cities. China and Russia are watching this unfold with barely concealed glee. A weak, divided Europe cannot stand up to Chinese economic pressure or Russian military adventurism. France is a nuclear power and a permanent Security Council member, but a France consumed by internal chaos cannot project power abroad. Eastern European countries that depend on French support against Russian aggression will be left vulnerable. The balance of global power will shift dramatically away from the West, accelerating American decline and ushering in a new era of authoritarian dominance. The timeline for this collapse is unclear, but the direction is not. France cannot continue on its current path. Something has to give, and soon. Either the French people will accept painful reforms that will lower their standard of living and trigger social unrest on an unprecedented scale, or the country will default on its debts and collapse economically, triggering a European-wide depression. There is no third option, no magical solution that lets France maintain its generous social model while remaining competitive in a globalized economy. What makes this tragedy so poignant is that it was entirely preventable. Economists have been warning about these structural problems for decades. French politicians knew the pension system was unsustainable, but lacked the courage to fix it when reforms would have been less painful. The integration failures in immigrant communities were visible 30 years ago, but addressing them was considered politically incorrect. The regulatory burden on businesses was obviously crushing entrepreneurship, but the unions and left-wing parties blocked every attempt at labor market reform. The French people themselves bear responsibility for this crisis. They voted for politicians who promised them comfortable retirements, short work weeks, generous unemployment benefits, and world-class public services, all while refusing to work longer hours or accept higher taxes to pay for these promises. The French have lived beyond their means for decades, borrowing from future generations to maintain a lifestyle their economy cannot support. Now the bill has come due, and there's no money left to pay it. France is simply the first domino to fall, but the others are lined up right behind it. Belgium, with its linguistic divisions and massive debt. Spain, with its regional separatism and youth unemployment. Italy, with its political chaos and stagnant economy. These countries are all following France down the same path. The human cost of this collapse will be staggering. Imagine being a French retiree who worked for 40 years, paid into the system faithfully, and is now watching your pension lose its purchasing power month by month. Imagine being a young French graduate with a master's degree, unable to find a job that matches your qualifications, forced to live with your parents into your 30s. Imagine being a small business owner in France, crushed by taxes and regulations, watching as your life's work circles the drain. These aren't statistics. These are millions of real people whose lives are being destroyed by the failure of their political and economic system. Some analysts argue that France can still pull back from the brink, that structural reforms can be implemented, that economic growth can be reignited. These optimists point to successful reforms in Nordic countries or Germany's Hartz labor market reforms in the early 2000s. But France is not Sweden or Germany. French political culture is uniquely resistant to reform, French unions are uniquely powerful, and French people are uniquely attached to their social model. Every attempt at reform triggers massive strikes and protests that paralyze the country until the government backs down. The COVID-19 pandemic gave us a preview of what's coming. France's debt exploded as the government borrowed massively to support workers and businesses during lockdowns. That debt will never be repaid. It will simply be rolled over indefinitely until confidence collapses and, the whole scheme unravels. The pandemic also exposed the weakness of French healthcare, with hospitals overwhelmed and medical staff pushed to breaking point, despite France spending more on healthcare as a percentage of GDP than almost any other country. Climate change will only accelerate France's decline. The country faces severe water shortages, increased flooding, and agricultural disruption that will strain its resources even further. The transition to renewable energy requires massive investment that France simply doesn't have. French nuclear power plants, once a source of national pride, are aging and expensive to maintain or replace. The country that once led the world in nuclear technology now struggles to build new reactors on time or on budget, with flagship projects years behind schedule and billions over budget. The financial markets are already beginning to price in French risk. The spread between French and German government bonds has been widening, meaning investors demand higher returns to lend to France compared to Germany. This spread will continue to grow as France's situation deteriorates, making borrowing ever more expensive and, honestly, accelerating the debt spiral. There will come a moment, impossible to predict, but inevitable nonetheless, when the markets simply refuse to lend to France at any reasonable rate, and that moment will mark the beginning of the endgame. What happens after the collapse is anyone's guess. Optimists hope for a phoenix rising from the ashes, a renewed France that has, learned from its mistakes and built a more sustainable model. Pessimists fear decades of economic stagnation, social strife, and political extremism, with France becoming a cautionary tale studied by future historians. The truth will likely fall somewhere between these extremes, but one thing is certain: the France that emerges from this crisis will be unrecognizable compared to the France of today. For the rest of Europe, the question is not whether France will take them down, but how far down they'll go. Will it be a severe recession that sets the continent back a decade, or a full-scale depression that undoes 70 years of integration and prosperity? Will European institutions like the EU and ECB survive the crisis, or will they collapse along with the French economy? Will NATO hold together if its second most powerful European member is consumed by internal chaos? These are the questions that should be keeping European leaders awake at night. So, what can be done? For individual Europeans, the advice is grim, but clear. Prepare for hard times. Diversify your assets. Don't keep all your savings in European banks. And, honestly, consider holding some wealth in hard assets or foreign currencies. If you're young and mobile, develop skills that are valuable globally and be ready to leave if necessary. If you're older and less mobile, build strong local networks of family and community that can provide support when government services fail. These are the strategies people have used throughout history to survive economic collapse, and they'll be necessary again. For European politicians, the path forward requires courage that few have shown. They must level with their populations about the severity of the crisis, implement painful but necessary reforms, even in the face of massive resistance, and rebuild their economies on sustainable foundations rather than debt and delusion. This will require political will that transcends election cycles and leaders who are willing to sacrifice their careers for their country's futures. Such leaders are rare in any era, and particularly rare in our current age of short-term thinking and social media politics. The collapse of France and the potential bankruptcy of Europe is not just an economic story, it's a civilizational moment that will define the 21st century. We are watching the slow-motion disintegration of the post-war European order, the end of an era when Europe believed it could have it all. Generous welfare states, short working hours, early retirement, mass immigration, and global influence, all at the same time. That era is ending, and what comes next will be shaped by how Europe responds to this crisis in the coming months and years. This is the moment we'll tell our grandchildren about, when the old world died and something new was born from its ashes. Pay attention, stay informed, and prepare accordingly. Because what happens in France won't stay in France. It will reshape the entire global order in ways we're only beginning to understand. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our coverage as this crisis unfolds. Drop a comment with your predictions for how this will play out. The end of Europe as we know it is here, and we're witnessing history in real time.